Our gospel lesson this morning comes from the 9th chapter of Mark. After 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and John with him and led them up a high mountain where they were all alone. There he transfigured before them. His clothes became dazzling white, whiter than anyone in the world could bleach them. And there appeared before them Elijah and Moses, who were talking with Jesus. Peter said to Jesus, "Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He did not know what to say. They were so frightened. Then a cloud appeared and enveloped them, and a voice came from the cloud, "This is my son whom I love. Listen to him." Suddenly, when they looked around, they no longer saw anyone with them except Jesus. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus gave them orders not to tell anyone what they had seen until the Son of Man had risen from the dead. They kept the matter to themselves, discussing what rising from the dead meant. The gospel of the Lord. Please be seated. Good morning, everybody. My name's Tony. I'm super glad to be here. I want to thank the guys in this congregation who have taken me out pheasant hunting this weekend. This is a little thing I do where people call me up and say, "Hey, will you come guest preach at my church?" And my response is, only if I get to hunt. So I do this in a few different places. I've told some of you already, I go every year to Gackle, North Dakota, and duck hunt, and I preach at a church there that had this year 9 people in the congregation when I preached. And next weekend, I'll be at a church in Huron, South Dakota, where I'll preach probably in front of about 15 people. So it's fantastic to see a country church like this thriving, and you all are going against trend, which is something I want to talk a little bit about this morning. But first, we have to address the elephant in the room. The Vikings game tonight. The Vikings, the NFL changed the schedule, conspiring against us and what we were planning here tonight at church, to move the Vikings game against the Bears to tonight. Here's my promise. You will get home by the second half if you come tonight. But here's the other thing. The Wall Street Journal a couple years ago did a study, and they watched all the NFL games for the entire season. So an NFL game is about 3.5 hours long. How much, in those 3.5 hours, how much time do you think the ball is actually in play in 3.5 hours? 11 minutes. 11 minutes. So get those DVRs out. You're going to get home. You're going to watch 11 minutes of TV, and you're going to see the Vikings beat the Bears. You'll be fine. You won't even remember what I talked about. You'll be so excited about that. Anyways, we'd love to see you tonight, where I'll be talking about my latest book about Jesus' crucifixion. But today it's about the transfiguration. The Gospel of Mark was the first gospel written. It's the shortest gospel. It's what theologians call the most primitive gospel. It has the least details. In fact, probably the resurrection wasn't even included in the first edition of Mark's gospel. So a lot of times when scholars look at gospels and they want to kind of figure out, get down to really the nut of what Jesus did or said, they will look at the Gospel of Mark relative to how Luke and Matthew will write up the same story. Because Mark gives us really the kernel of it, the most kind of pared down version of it. And this transfiguration story is a big one, right? I mean, it's one that a lot of us know. So it's interesting to look at the way Mark put this story together and see what lessons we can draw from it. Mark tells us that Jesus and his 3 closest disciples go up to the side of a mountain to pray. As they're praying, a cloud comes down, and the cloud goes back up, And suddenly, Jesus is standing in the middle of three figures. Now, here's a for instance of what Mark doesn't tell us. How in the world did those guys know that was Moses on one side and Elijah on the other side? It was not like they've been, I follow Moses on Instagram. That's Moses. How would they know what Moses looks like? So we're not given details like that. Here's a detail we're given. Jesus and the other two, they are dressed in clothes brighter than anyone on earth could bleach them, giving us a signal that there's something happening here that is otherworldly between Jesus, Moses, and Elijah. And here's another thing that happens. Mark tells us that the disciples are scared, that Jesus, Moses, and Elijah are speaking together, and that Peter says, Rabbi, it's good for us to be here. Let's put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. A lot of you grew up with a version of the Bible that said, let's put up 3 tabernacles. Remember that? Let's put up 3 tabernacles, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah. Then, here's what's interesting. Mark rarely adds editorial comments. You can almost see Mark sitting there with his whatever quill and his parchment, writing this gospel, and he writes this. Peter says, Rabbi, it's good for us to be here. Let's put up 3 tabernacles, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah. And he stops and he thinks, people are going to read this and be like, why did Peter say that? So Mark adds, he said this because they were so afraid they didn't know what to say. There's this little editorial comment that Mark adds to try to explain to us why Peter said this. Now, one thing that's interesting is like the version that was on the screen or that's in your pew Bible, it has parentheses around it. You very rarely see parentheses in the Bible. The Bible, the New Testament, when it was written, it had no punctuation at all. Parchment was so valuable that when people wrote, there are no commas, there are no periods, there are no quotation marks in any of the original documents. Not that we have any of the original, but we have some copies. And there's no punctuation. So all punctuation is added by translators later. So the translators of this version of the Bible, they decided to put parentheses around this sentence. It's almost like Mark is, if he's writing a play, it's like, an aside to the audience. You know what I mean? In a drama. When you say it like a whisper, but you say it loud enough for the whole audience to hear it. Mark is saying this. Here's another interesting thing. In all 4 Gospels, this is the only time when someone makes a direct claim or question to Jesus and Jesus doesn't respond. Only time. Rabbi, it's good for us to be here. Let's put these 3 shelters. Then the story just moves on. Jesus doesn't give Peter a reply. So again, it makes you wonder, why would Mark include this line, this sentence from Peter, if Jesus doesn't even consider it important enough to respond to? The cloud descends, Jesus is alone, and he starts walking down the mountain. The disciples, who probably said a lot of other things like, holy bleep, or whatever, when all this stuff was happening, they kind of are walking down the mountain with him, and he says to them, do not talk about any of this until the Son of Man has risen from the dead. And then the 3 of them talk amongst themselves, what do you think this means, this rising from the dead? And the story ends of this little episode in the life of Jesus and his closest disciples. Here we are at a church celebrating 150 years with a cake, which I've been told is not real. Is it true? I sent my wife a picture of the cake, and she was like, "That's an awesome cake." And I said, "I'm afraid it's not. It's a copy of a cake." But it's like your Ebenezer. You know, we heard that in that opening call to worship. Ebenezer. This is what people in the Old Testament did. They would raise an Ebenezer. That means a pile of stones. They would raise an Ebenezer to commemorate something God had done in the life of Israel. Bethel was a place where they raised an Ebenezer. God did a miracle here. Let's remember it. So this was not uncommon in the religion in which Peter grew up. That if God does something incredible, like transform Jesus' clothes and bring Elijah and Moses back from the dead to confer with him, that Peter would be like, we have to commemorate this. Let's raise an Ebenezer. Let's put up a tent. Let's have a plaque, right? And interestingly, Jesus doesn't even dignify Peter's question with a response. He walks down the mountain, and in the Gospel of Mark, from this point on, his face is toward Jerusalem in his passion. So in this story, we have this incredible tension between Peter, who throughout the Gospel of Mark represents what literally you would call everyman. Peter is everyman, right? He's us in the story. We're supposed to sympathize with Peter because he just says kind of silly things and he's trying to figure out what everything means all the time. That's Peter's role in the Gospel of Mark, just like in this story right now. So you've got Peter doing what we do. We commemorate what the Lord has done. We build churches and denominations and seminaries, and we put up plaques and cakes, and we take photographs. I saw the photograph of the 125th anniversary of this church, and I'm sure there's going to be a big 150th anniversary photo taken, right? Yeah, of course. It's what we do. So what Peter's doing is not a bad thing. But those of us who follow Jesus just need to remember it's not what Jesus did. Jesus did not start a church. He did not start a denomination. He did not start a seminary. Jesus didn't stand still. He didn't even take the time to answer Peter. He just went down the mountain toward his passion. For those of us who follow Jesus, there is always a tension between our human desire to commemorate what the Lord has done and our calling to follow a Messiah who never stops moving. Amen.
Go in peace and serve the Lord. Thanks be to God.